Hi, my name is David Kelsey. Today we're going to cover a lecture on what's called formalizing an argument. Okay, and so formalizing an argument is basically the process of boiling the argument down, of trimming down the argument into its just kind of essential pieces, right? And so what we're going to do is we're going to start. Usually, when you formalize an argument, you start with a kind of paragraph or two, which we'll call a passage. And a passage, what it does is it presents an argument just kind of in ordinary language. But the trick about passages like this is that it's oftentimes a little hard to pick out exactly what the conclusion of the argument is, and then also what the reasons being given are, right? And then how the reasons relate to each other, and then also how they link up to the conclusion. So what we're going to do today is learn how to understand that process and how to capture that ourselves, right? How to apply that kind of idea to a passage on our own, right? And so essentially we're gonna learn how to do this ourselves, okay? Usually a formalization will consist of a listed and numbered set of claims, right? And the last claim will be, the conclusion of the argument, and then listed before that, prior to that, would be a set of premises, right? So that's kind of the idea. When we're formalizing, the idea is, again, we're going to start with the passage. We're going to pull out the premises and conclusion of the passage, right? And so the question is, how do we do that? A couple of things that will help us in spotting the premises and conclusion. First, as we talked about in lecture 1, are these kind of indicator words and phrases, okay? And so the idea then when you formalize is that you're really trying to pick out the premises and conclusion that the author meant to give, right? And their kind of most basic, bare bones, simplified form, all right? Now, when we do that, when we formalize, what we want to do is follow a basic rule. And the rule we're going to call the structure rule. Okay, the structure rule. So the idea behind the structure rule is that you want to organize your numbered list, your claims, your conclusion, and your premises in a way that makes sense, that captures the nature of the argument, right? So what we're going to say is that when an argument makes an inference, that what you want to do is you want to number the formalization to reflect that inference, right? And so when you have one claim inferred from another claim, what you want to do is number the second claim, the inferred claim, as to follow the first one. So it will be numbered after in the sequence, right? And so that's the structure rule. Anytime an inference is made, the inferred claim is numbered later in the sequence. Now, of course, because the conclusion of an argument is always going to be the last inference the argument makes, so what's going to follow from that then is that the conclusion of an argument will always go last in the sequence, right? It's the final inference made, and so it's the last step in the number order of the formalization, okay? Now, what we're going to do here to formalize an argument, the first thing you want to do then is, just to kind of get underway, is you want to try to pick out the claims that go into the argument, okay? And what you want to do is essentially just pick out anything that you think belongs, right? And then what you're going to do is sort of number them in sequence. Now, at this point, the number order, right, the sequence will be out of order, right? Everything might be out of place, So the conclusion might be in the middle, or it might be in the beginning of the sequence. What you're essentially doing is just taking out anything you think is important, right? Now, once you get that list of claims that you think belongs in the argument, what you want to do is focus on organizing that list to map onto the structure of the argument. You want to use that structure rule. So what we're going to do to organize that list, to learn to find the structure of an argument so that we can map that formalization onto it, right? What we're going to do is just use a kind of set of symbols to pick out the reasoning that the argument is giving us, the path of inferences it takes, right? So the first kind of symbol that we're going to use is the arrow. Now, the arrow will symbolize the idea of an inference, okay? And so what we say is that when we have one claim Q inferred from another P, we're going to write P, arrow to Q, right? And it will kind of work down. So P arrow Q just means that P is a reason for Q. We have an inference being made from P to Q, right? That's what it means. Our next type of symbolization is for the idea of a dependent set of premises. So if you remember back to lecture 2, dependent premises are premises that work together, depend upon one another to support some claim, right? So when you have dependent premises, you symbolize that dependence with a plus symbol, with an addition symbol, right? So say, for example, P and Q dependently support some conclusion R, right? In this case, I would symbolize it with a P, right, plus Q, and then I kind of underline it a bit, and then you have an arrow down to R, both from P and Q, right? Not individually, but together, right? And so what we have is we have a kind of P plus Q down to R, right? And that just tells us that P and Q are together dependently supporting R. Okay, the next type of symbolization is for what we call independent premises. So in some cases, you might have two premises that independently support the conclusion of an argument, right? In this case, both of the premises are kind of working on their own to support that same conclusion, okay? So imagine P and Q are two different claims that independently support some claim R, some conclusion R, right? In this case, what we do is we write P arrow to R. At the same time, though, independently, we write Q with an arrow to R. And so this symbolizes both P and Q being independent reasons for R. Okay? We can also have, in some cases, we'll have one reason for two different claims. So the reason here, this piece of evidence will support two different things, right? So for example, say that I had a claim P supporting both Q and R, being a reason for both two different claims Q and R. In this case, what we're going to do is have an arrow from P to Q and an arrow from P to R at the same time, right? This will symbolize the fact that P is working to support both. Lastly, our last bit of symbolization that we'll discuss here is in some cases you'll actually have several different reasons in favor of a conclusion, right? Sometimes they'll be independent and sometimes dependent reasons. So imagine that we had dependently supporting some claim two reasons, and then we had a third reason independently supporting that third claim, right? Imagine we had that. How would we symbolize it? So let's just say then that P and Q together dependently are supporting some third claim S, right? In that case, we would have P plus Q and then an arrow down to S, right? But imagine at the same time, though, that you've got some other claim R that's also working to support S, okay? So then in that case, we would have at the same time an arrow from R to S, okay? And so that's how we symbolize dependent and independent reasons occurring at the same time for the same claim. Okay, so now at this point in the lecture, we're going to use and we're going to give an example. And so the example here, what we'll do is we'll actually apply all the symbolization that we just learned, and this will allow you to see it kind of in application, right, in action. Okay, now just a kind of disclaimer about this passage. It's all fiction, right? There's no person that this is really referring to. In fact, this is just a passage that I picked up out of your textbook, okay? And so the idea is that what we have here is an argument that's being stated in this short little paragraph. And so what we're going to try to do is pull the argument out and formalize it, right? And of course, we're going to follow the structure rule when we do. and then we're going to see if we can, at the end of this, come up with the final formalization, the steps that we have in this argument, right? Okay, so you can see here the claim begins, I don't think we should get Carlos's own car, right? So this is about a guy, Carlos, and his car, right? Then it says, as a matter of fact, he's not responsible because he doesn't care for his things. And anyway, we don't have enough money for a car, since even now we have trouble making ends meet. And then it says, last week you yourself complained about our financial situation, and you never complain without really good reason. Okay, so that's the passage we're working with. As you can see, it's a one paragraph with a few sentences in it. Now, what we want to do first off when we're trying to formalize the argument in here is we want to approach it carefully by looking for the indicator words and phrases that were mentioned in lecture 1. Here you can see those in bold, right? So you have in the second sentence there, it says, as a matter of fact, right, which is a kind of premise indicator. He is not responsible because he doesn't care for his things. That because is also another premise indicator word. Then in the next sentence it says, and anyway. Usually an and is a kind of indicator word as well. So we have there also an indicator of probably a reason, right? And then it says, and anyway, we don't have enough money for a car, since even now we have trouble making ends meet. That sentence is also another indicator word as well. Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to try to pick out the claims that go in this argument, not necessarily putting them in order at this point. We're just going to be pulling claims out as we see fit, right? As they look to be important, we're going to list them. So the first claim that we're going to pull out of the passage there is the very first one there. I have it in bold. It says, I don't think we should get Carlos's own car. You know, when you read the passage, I think you can see that kind of claim is important. It just stands out. It's the first claim the argument makes, the passage makes, and it seems to be carrying some significance, right? So we're going to state that, and then we're going to give it the number 1 in our list. Now, the next sentence, what we're going to see there is this idea of, it says, as a matter of fact, right, he's not responsible because he doesn't care for his things. And so we're going to actually include both of those in our list at this point. So you have 2 here, he is not responsible, that's what's right before the because, and then what follows the because, he doesn't care for his things, will go as third in our list. Okay, so far our list includes 3 things. I don't think we should get Carlos's own car. He's not responsible, and he doesn't care for his things. Now what we'll do is we'll go to the next sentence in the passage. The next sentence begins, and anyway, we don't have enough money for a car, since even now you have trouble making ends meet. And again, here we have that kind of indicator of since, right? And so what we're going to do is include both of those into our list at this point, right? So we have 4, we don't have enough money for a car, and 5, even now we have trouble making ends meet. Okay. Now next on the list will be our final sentence, the final sentence of the passage, which says, last week you yourself complained about our financial situation, and then you never complained without really good reason. You can see there that and seems to be doing some work as well, right? And in fact, that seems to be a kind of indication that you have here 2 different reasons for some claim, right? And so what we're going to do is include both what's before and after the and as our 6 and 7, right? So 6 is, last week you yourself complained about our financial situation, and 7 is that you never complain without really good reason, okay? And so that's our list there. We have 7 claims. Now they're completely out of order at this point, right? The conclusion isn't listed as number 7 yet. And when we actually finish our formalization, that's what will happen, right? We'll formalize it so that that list of 7 maps on to the inferences that the argument is making. So what we'll do now is we'll take this list of 7 and we'll use the numbers here, right? So we'll use 1 to stand for that first claim, we shouldn't get Carlos's own car, and so on. And we'll take those numbers and we're going to try to work out the structure of this argument given that symbolization that we learned a few slides back, right? The arrows and so on. Okay, so the first question we'll ask is, what is the relationship between claims 2 and 3, right? Claim 2 is that Carlos is not responsible, and claim 3 is Carlos doesn't care for his things. So what's the relationship between these two? What's the structure? What is the inference that's being made here? Now, if you look back at the passage, you'll see that the sentence in which 2 and 3 occur in goes like this. It says, as a matter of fact, he's not responsible because he doesn't care for his things. Now, usually what a because does is it tells us that what is after the because is a reason for what's before, right? What's after is a reason for what's before. So here we see then that he doesn't care for his things is a reason for him not being responsible. And that makes sense, right? If he doesn't care for his things, he's not really a responsible person, right? So what that means then, the way we symbolize this then, is that 3 is a reason for 2, okay? And so we're going to symbolize it as 3 down arrow, or 3 arrow symbol, down to 2. So that's the symbolization we get here. 3 arrow to 2. Now we can ask, what is the relationship between the first claim and the second, right? The first claim says, I don't think we should get Carlos his own car. And the second says, he is not responsible. Now again, if we look back at the passage, we can see the order here. We can see the inference made. It says, I don't think we should get Carlos his own car. As a matter of fact, he's not responsible. The as a matter of fact, what it's doing is it's telling us that what's after, right? Him not being responsible is a reason for what's before, that we shouldn't get him his own car, right? And that makes sense, because if he's not responsible, we shouldn't get him his own car. So what we say then is that 2 is a reason for 1, and so we symbolize this as 2 arrow to 1. Now we can ask, what's the relationship between claim 4 and claim 5, right? Now, claim 4 says we don't have enough money for a car. Claim 5 says we have trouble making ends meet, right? And again, the best thing to do is look back at the passage to determine the context, right? And to see if there's any indicators there at all and so on. So in the passage, it looks like this. And anyway, we don't have enough money for a car, since even now we have trouble making ends meet. Now, what a since does, right, is it tells us that what's after is a reason for what's before, right? So even now we have trouble making ends meet is a reason for not having enough money for a car, right? And that again makes sense, because if we can't eat, then we shouldn't be buying a car. It's that simple, right? So here then, 5, claim 5, right, we have trouble making ends meet is a reason to think 4, we don't have enough money for a car. And so the structure goes from 5 arrow to 4. Okay? Now, last step in the process is we'll look at the relationship between 4, 6, and 7. Okay, so 4 says we don't have enough money for a car, and 6 says last week you complained about our finances, and 7 then says you never complain without really good reason. Now, if you just think about those claims there, you can see pretty quickly that 6 and 7 are both reasons for the idea that we don't have enough money for a car, right? If we're complaining about our finances, and we don't really complain unless we have good reason to, that's a good reason why we don't really have enough money for a car, right? So now the question is, right, we know that 6 and 7 are reasons for 4, so now the question is, are they independent reasons for 4 or dependent? And I think the place to see how this question is answered is to again look back at the passage, right? The passage, again, what it says is, last week you complained about our financial situation and you never complained without really good reason. In this case, the and, what it's telling us is that these things are cooperating, right? And so what we have then is dependent reasons in favor of the claim that we don't have enough money for a car. Those reasons are both that last week you complained about our finances and you never complained without really good reason. Another nice indicator here that these are dependent premises is that they're kind of about the same thing, right? They're kind of both about complaining. One says that you're complaining, and then the other says that you don't really complain unless you have reason to, right? And so that's kind of also an indicator that these are dependent premises. So then the way we symbolize this, right? Dependent premises, you kind of have this plus symbol. And so we have a 6 plus 7 and then down to 4, right? 6 plus 7 down to 4. Okay, so now if you look at the symbolization that we have so far, you can kind of start to throw things together. Okay, so for example, you can see that 5, 6, and 7 are all reasons in favor of 4. And 3 is a reason for 2, but 2 is a reason for 1. So then we can kind of put that all together, and so we have this kind of big sort of structure, which is that 5, 6, and 7 are going down to 4, and then 3 is down to 2, and 2 to 1. The last question, though, is what is the relationship between 4 and 1, right? You don't really have that stuff connecting yet. So let's think about it. 1 says, I don't think we should get Carlos's own car. And 4 says, we don't have enough money for a car. Now, if you think just about those two claims, I mean, I think it's easy to see, right, when you think about it, that if you don't have enough money for a car, you shouldn't get one, right? And so what we're going to say then is that 4 is a reason for 1, okay? And so you can see then that the symbolization here, it looks like this. 3 is down to 2 and 2 to 1, and then you have 5, 6, and 7 all down to 4, but then 4 also has this arrow down to 1 as well. So then we see here really that 1, which is that, we shouldn't get Carlos's own car, is the conclusion of our argument, right? 1 is the conclusion, okay? And so then what we're going to do now, since we have our structure, right? 3 is down to 2, 2 to 1, and then 5, 6, and 7 all down to 4, and 4 down to 1. Since we have that structure, now what we can do is reorganize all those numbers to map on and reflect that structure. So for example, 1 again there, which is that I don't think we should get Carlos's own car, will end up being the conclusion of our argument, right? And what we'll do essentially really is just number down. We'll number downward in the structure. So claim 3 there will probably be something like reordered and renumbered as claim 1, and then claim 2 might stay as 2, and 5, 6, and 7 might be like 3, 4, and 5, and so on, right? So that brings us to the final look at things here, right? So we have here a look at the numbered sequence before we've taken a look at the structure, right? And so we see that number 1 there is that we shouldn't get Carlos's own car, right? Now we saw that that ends up being the conclusion of the argument. So you can see then that what we've done is we've made that the conclusion of the argument, right? That becomes 7 once we've renumbered our list to map onto the structure. And so that's what we do, is we kind of just renumber everything and reorder everything to map onto that structure. And so we end up with this final formalization, right? And this is really what your formalization will look like in the end, right? It says 1, Carlos doesn't care for his things. Therefore, 2, Carlos isn't responsible. Now you can notice after 2, what I've done is I put from 1, and that just indicates that 1 there is a reason for 2, right? Carlos doesn't care for his things. That's a reason for Carlos not being responsible, okay? Now the next step in the sequence, we have 3. Last week you complained about our finances, and then 4, you never complain without really good reason. And those also are followed by 5, we have trouble making ends meet. Now you can see then all 3 of those claims, 3, 4, and 5, are the reasons given for 6, which is that we don't have enough money for a car, right? And you can see after 6 there, I've got in parentheses from 3, 4, and 5, okay? Then lastly, what we do is we state that conclusion of our argument. That conclusion is always going to go last. And we have the conclusion there as we shouldn't get Carlos's own car. And you can see that conclusion, it's interesting actually that conclusion only follows from claims 2 and 6. So the claim that Carlos isn't responsible and that we don't have enough money for a car directly supports the conclusion that we shouldn't get him a car, right? And then of course the other claims, right, are supporting those 2 premises, right? So 1 is supporting 2, and 3, 4, and 5 are all supporting 6, and then 2 and 6 are all supporting 7. Okay? And so that's the final structure of the argument, and that's our final formalization. Okay? And so that's kind of how the sequence works. We work from kind of just pulling things out of the passage to actually having them in the right order. And that's the idea of formalizing, right? Diagramming and structuring the argument in an organized way so that it looks simple enough as opposed to the passage that we've pulled it from, right? Okay, well, that'll do it for today then. That's our kind of first lecture on formalizing. And hopefully you understand the idea, and you got a good sense of the idea of going from a passage to an actually structured, organized argument representation of that passage. So hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.